Welcome to Directionally Correct, a People's podcast with Cole and Scott. Today's guest, Dr. Guru Sethupathy.
Thanks to our sponsors, Worklytics. Generate actionable insights from work data while protecting your privacy using workplace analytics with our partners, Worklytics.
This is a curb your enthusiasm moment right here.
Yes.
Like, we know you're a fan.
Are you a fan as well, Scott?
I feel like the older seasons were more of these, like, we got a great idea, we're going to build a story around it. And the later ones are more like kind of story arcs, like around like the coffee shop or, built around a central story. So it's slightly different, but it's kind of like changing times too. You kind of see that across the entire entertainment landscape, really.
I'll give you one example before we pivot. I told my wife there was this chocolate, and I was like, no matter what, don't give me any more. No matter what. Do you remember the no matter what episode, Scott? Like,
I don't.
He told Susie to Susie told him, like, no matter what, don't give me any more cake. No matter what, don't get, like, no matter what. And then he like laid down the law and she got pissed. And so it's a whole episode about that. So
I think my favorite like individual moment was they were over at Susie and Jeff's house, and I think the daughter, it's a big party, they're always having a party, right. And they have the daughter up and they're like, okay, sing us your little song, little Susie, whatever her name is, and like she starts singing, and like it's visible that Larry doesn't like this. He's like, all right, good job, trying to get her to shut up. It's just glorious. And everyone, of course, calls him an asshole and all this stuff. But it's like, I've been there in my life. Just make this end.
Well, Guru, perhaps I can introduce you real quick so people know who you are. Guru, and tell me if I'm saying this wrong, Sethupathy, is that correct?
You got it.
All right. He's a PhD founder and CEO of Fair Now AI. He spent the last 15 years focused on analytics and AI technology and human capital. Previously worked at McKinsey, as well as a senior executive at Capital One, where he built a people analytics technology and strategy function. And he recently left Capital One to start Fair Now, whose mission is to help companies demonstrate that how they're building and deploying AI technologies responsibly. But maybe we could start with just tell us about your time building a function at Capital One. That's where I became familiar with you. It seems like you all built sort of a juggernaut over there. Really impressive team. Do you want to talk about that at all, Guru?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, thanks for the kind introduction. Cole, good to chat with you. Scott, good to chat with you as well. Yeah, I joined Capital One early 2017. And coming in, I had kind of my own kind of aspirations and vision for like melding what I thought was something that had not been done before, which is bringing science, data, technology, and just like real deep thinking to the talent space, right? And I felt there was an opportunity to blend the best of both worlds. And Capital One wasn't initially on my radar, but when I started interviewing with them, I thought they'd be the perfect home to kind of try out this vision, because I don't know how much you guys know. I don't know if you guys have a Capital One credit card in your wallet, but they're an incredibly data and technology based financial. Because initially I was like, oh, it's a bank, like, I don't know if I really want to go work at a bank. But when I, through my interview process, and this is why interviews are super important, guys, by the way, because this is an HR topic. When you do interviews are both ways. I'm sure you guys, say this often, but like interviews are going both ways. And they really impressed me with how they interviewed me, right? The type of questions they have, the rigor, the analytics, the data, and the problems that they asked me. And so that caught my attention. I was like, oh, this isn't a typical interview process. This isn't a typical bank. And so when I realized kind of their origin story about how Capital One started, how it was all about kind of data-based decision-making and analytics-based decision-making, I was like, wait, that's what I want to do. I just want to do it in a different space, not in lending. I want to do it on hiring. I want to do it on promotion, right? Like, but the same kind of DNA. And so I tell people all the time, it was a great match from a DNA standpoint, right? What I wanted to do is something that, they wanted to cultivate as well. And I had tremendous support above me to go kind of, enact this vision and bring in the right type of talent, bring in a new type of talent. A lot of people I hired and brought into that organization were not people analytics folks before necessarily, or even HR folks, but they had like some really cool set of skills that were relevant.
A lot of organizations or, people analyst functions are talking about dashboards or this sort of thing. Like what separates what you were doing at Capital One from standard practices that we hear about in people analytics.
Look, we built dashboards along the way too, so don't get me wrong.
Of course,
Like,
of course.
You know,
it,
like
it
those
solves
are-
a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. It solves a problem and it's an important step. But I think a couple of things that I think differentiated us. One is the vision that we had was just really ambitious, right? It was just really
Okay.
ambitious. And so I think that got people excited, right? I don't think you can get, no, again, like I said, dashboards are important, right? But if I come in and I'm like, hey guys, I'm going to give you a couple of dashboards, it's just different, right? It's just a different type of conversation. It's a different level of resourcing. It's a different level of influence, right? And so if I'm like, hey guys, imagine this, and I painted a picture where I was like, imagine a world where you're getting real-time data on your teams, on your organizations. Imagine a world where you're kind of interacting with your HR data and your HR insights through natural language. Imagine a world where we're able to help you hire talent differently because we have advanced technological assessment tools, right? Like, so when you start pitching things that way and start, imagining a vision that's much broader, of course, along the way, to get to New York from DC, I still got to go through Philly, right? Essentially, but you're getting further. You're painting a bigger vision. You're painting a broader vision. So I think that's one thing. And then the second thing is the influence we have from a strategic standpoint. I was in conversations with the CEO of Capital One on talent topics, right? And that's not something, again, and Cole, I brought this up at El Rayo when you had asked that question around what's the future of people analytics? Where do we go from here? And what I would love to see in this space is organizations follow that blueprint and have the opportunity where the head of people analytics or some kind of role like that is leading talent strategy, right? How do you shape how hiring gets done? How do you shape talent systems? How do you shape TM? Like, how do you, like, they don't necessarily have to own these things. Someone else kind of can operationalize it and so on and so forth. But being partners with the CHRO, potentially even the CEO or the COO, to actually set these systems in place and strategize about this, I think that's tremendous. That's the kind of influence we wanted to have, and we got eventually.
Scott, do you want to report to the CEO?
I am the CEO.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I mean, what's some of the work, Guru, that you did that you felt like you were most proud of there?
I'll give a couple of examples. The first thing we did is when I got there, the business did not trust HR data.
How so?
Well, that's what we had to figure out. We didn't know why. We're like, what's going on here? And we had to dig in. Is it because the data quality is bad? Is it, what is going on? And we finally uncovered what the thing was and we fixed it, right? So what it was is, think about the definition of attrition, right? When you're just talking, everyone's like, I know what attrition is. I know what that is. But then, you know what, if you're an analyst, once you start calculating that metric, that numerator, that denominator, you can define it like 10 different ways, right? And so what we'd have is one person in our team defining it one way, another analyst over here defining it another way, and they'd put it on 2 different decks, and it would look like Cole's attrition would be 8%, and another guy would be like, it's 8.5%, and it would show up in a deck in an important meeting, and they're like, wait, these numbers don't match. So again, that's what they saw. They saw that, and they're like, I don't trust HR's numbers. And then so we had to unwind and be like, why did that happen, right? And so we reorganized the team and how we did analysis so that we had a common source of truth, an intermediate data model that then allowed everyone to build off of the same set of calculations and the same set of data. So that was a big step, I'll say. And that happened early on in the first year, Cole. And what that did is that got us on a virtuous cycle, because then people started trusting our data. Then they started trusting the analysis that that we were doing. And then from there, you build credibility to do more ambitious things. So that's one. Just very quickly, the other things I'm really proud of is we started to be able to innovate and change the tools that Capital One was using to hire talent in some of their most important job families, their business analysts and their software engineering job families. And why this is such a big deal is Capital One had done this way for the last 25 years. This was like their baby. They'd done it this way forever, and they felt proud about the way they were doing it. And our team went and showed them, hey guys, this isn't working. So think about whatever it is, whatever organization you're in, and you're telling someone that is kind of proud of the way that's already happening, hey, you can do it better. We can do it better. And so we had to influence really senior folks. This went, all the way pretty high level to say, hey, we can do this better, and we did it better. So those are some examples.
Was there anything that you were doing at Capital One that kind of sparked the inspiration for Fair Now AI? Or was that just kind of a read of, there's a lot of change going on in the world right now. Algorithmic decision making seems to be really on the rise. We got to do something about this, kind of thing. Like, and I know you even told me before, I think you even dropped out of college and started a startup at one point. So this wasn't your first time just saying, hey, maybe now's the right time to strike. I don't know, talk to us about that journey.
Yeah, no, great question. There were actually two things that I saw that caused me to do this. One is Capital One is in the financial services industry, the banking industry, right? And I like to say banking and financial services is like 20 years ahead of HR in a couple of ways, right? One is just in terms of sophistication of using data and technology and all that, but also in terms of regulations, right? Like if you remember going back, I don't know if you guys remember the financial crisis and then going back even further, but there's like laws around lending. Who can you lend to? You can't be biased in your lending, right? Like you have to be protective of your data, your customer data, like all of this stuff. Finance has been solving for like decades, right? And I could tell, hey, this is going to come to HR. This is going to come to, the regulations are going to come, the data privacy, the data security, but also the use of data, like all of these things are going to come. So that was one observation I had. And one of the things I noticed is Capital One is awesome at risk management when it comes to the models that they use in their lending side. They have a ton of people, they have products, they have solutions that they use to be well governed on their lending models. And I was like, wait a second, but HR is not. So HR is using models and they're not well governed on, necessarily the models that they're using. So that was point number one. Point number two is I started seeing companies, external HR tech vendors coming and pitching us. And they would be like, oh, we're AI for this and we're AI for that. And I was like, oh, really? And my team, again, me and my team were sophisticated enough where we could really dig deep and ask tough questions. And we realized two things. Either they weren't really doing AI, or they were doing stuff that we thought was just not good practice, right? And so you combine these two things, and we felt there's a real need where it's kind of wild, wild west right now in HR technology, and it's going to change, and the laws are going to change, the governance expectations are going to change, and there's a real need for HR organizations and HR tech vendors to be well managed and be well governed on the models that they're building. And so that's what led us to do this.
I love that. People coming in and be like, well, we got linear regression, so we're AI, so why not? But
Scott, sometimes it wasn't even that.
Oh, really?
I mean, yeah. So sometimes it was just calculations,
Oh, we summed up two numbers and therefore we came up with an algorithm to add things up.
You guys joke about this, but that's actually really relevant to the New York City law that's going on. Because I mean, basically it's saying any kind of calculation is AI, which is crazy. But I don't know. Did you have a point you wanted to make there, Scott?
No, like Guru, you did a great presentation at Taurus on this New York City law, and I am not terribly familiar with it. I don't know how many other people are. Can you just give us an overview of it, and what are some of the implications of it too that we might be facing?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like on one sense, I'm annoyed by the law. In another sense, I think there is a positive from it. And I'll talk to you guys about that. But just tactically, it did go into effect July 5th, right? So after multiple revisions, feedback, all that kind of stuff, it finally did go into effect on July 5th. My blunt view of it is I have some problems with the law, right? And I'll share a couple. One, they define ADTs in just a weird way. In one way, it's kind of broad, and another way, it's super narrow, right? They talk about kind of substantially assist in decision making. Like, what does that mean, right? That's just going to lend itself to a lot of confusion, in my view. So that's kind of one issue there. Another issue that I have a problem with is publicizing. You have to publicly report your findings. To me, that is just a terrible idea. And the reason for that is raw fairness group comparisons are misleading.
Yep.
Oh gosh, I've studied this for so long. There's so many double clicks and triple clicks and quadruple clicks. You got to go down to really understand if you have fairness or unfairness, right? Yeah. And anytime that once you put, hey, we have the impact ratio of 66%, no one's going to read past that. No one's going to read past that. And it doesn't matter how many caveats you put. It doesn't matter if you put an explanation report attached to it. People are just going to run with that number. People are just going to run with that
Yeah.
number. And that's just not fair. It's just not the right incentives that you want to create, right? And so I have
Isn't that kind of just like the sign of our times, though? Is that simplicity always wins over nuance, and it's stupid, but it's what's going on.
Well, that's
Yeah.
why I'm worried, Cole, because of that point. Like if people are not, just want to run with their perception, their worldview of things, right? And so if they have a thing for a company and they're like, I want, I think that company's not fair, and then they're just going to use whatever they can to like support that view, right?
Well, yeah, like think about from the company's perspective. Like on one hand, we could use AI technology, and perhaps we get disparate impact. We have to report that information, or we could use, I don't know, human judgment, which we know is not as sophisticated, not as reliable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and not report it. Plus, get who we want in the door, right?
Yeah. Well, and I've got an article coming out probably by the time this podcast is live with a friend of yours, Scott Jackson Roach, about just
Nice.
this point of like, it's about weighing the merits of human decision making versus automated decision making. And there's this baseline assumption here that if we just removed all the algorithms, we could get back to the good old days of human decision making. It's like, those were never the good old days. Like, I don't know what you guys were talking about.
Let's remove the
So-
science from hiring science.
The word I always use is counterfactual. And what counterfactual means is what would have happened otherwise, right? And so exactly, anytime someone comes and says AI is biased and they want to take it out, I'm like, what's the counterfactual? The counterfactual is we go back to a world where humans are making decisions. And that is, it's been shown not to be an incredibly wonderful outcome on a whole host of dimensions. Not to get way off tangent here, but I have the same issue on issues like standardized test scores, for instance, right? Like this has been a huge debate, and I don't want to get into
Well, it's kind of the same principle.
Yeah, I don't want to get too into the politics of this or anything like that. But like, if you look at it, like the SATs, sure, there's probably some issues of bias around kind of these standardized test scores, and I know the College Board and others they work really hard at like trying to minimize that and so on and so forth. But if you get rid of that, what's the counterfactual? Recommendation letters? I mean, how worse? I mean, that to me is like 10 times worse.
No, Guru, we get to go back to good old human judgment. Like it's
That's what I mean.
infallible.
Recommendation letters, right? That's what's going to be in the package.
I mean,
exactly.
Nepotism, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Guru, you wrote a really excellent article about understanding the New York City law, which we'll tag in the show notes. I think it covers some of the high points of what you've mentioned here. One of the things that really kind of grind the gears about it, and I think I'll link to it as well in the show notes, was something that Charles Handler put together. He wrote something about basically the New York City law is kind of trying to subtly overturn the uniform guidelines of selection from the EEOC. And those have been considered the gold standard. I mean, we learned about them in graduate school. I've practiced them in the real world and doing selection. They're really good and they're really fair. And this is things that, really smart people have considered for a long time. It's been legally adjudicated. And so it got me thinking about this notion. It's like, are we really starting to kind of be governed? Like, we're not like a country or a world anymore. We're going back to like a city-state form of governance where, like Sparta and Athens, they control their own respective territories, and New York City law governs all of us now. Like, I don't understand this. This doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I think you got a lot of that in that comment. So I'm going to take this in parts here. So the first part, I know what you're saying, right? Like all the work that has been done around validation in particular. And I know you got deep expertise in this, Cole, and I was actually talking to Keith Sonderling about that, and we were agreeing, right? Like the EEOC and like all these rules that have been established over a long period of time around like what is bias, what is fairness, and around validation in particular, right? Validation is very important, and this goes to the point I was making around nuance, right? You can have differences in outcomes if the validation behind it is justifiable and validated, right? Like that's the science behind it, right? And this doesn't take any of that into account. So that's what I meant when I was saying the double click and the triple click that you need to go into. That's the validation part of it. That's the deeper analysis and the validation behind it. That is, as you guys have been taught in IO psychology, that is the right way to do things. And this doesn't take any of that into account. So again, I'm in complete agreement with you, complete agreement, right? So I don't have an issue. The part that I will then challenge you on, because I know you guys like challenges on the show, is this idea, like, look.
Do we? Are we known for our debates? It's like everybody just throws up the white flag immediately.
No, I'm not ready for that. So here's where I will challenge you. This notion of like, hey, the city state, no, to go a little bit into history here, that's who we are as Americans, America. We're a country, we started out as a bunch of states. And for anyone who comes from abroad and tries to figure out this country, they get really confused because most other countries are very top down. They're very kind of central government heavy and, federal laws, and the states are kind of have weaker power, right? And that's not how we are here, right? The states have incredible power. These are things being debated, not just around bias and fairness of AI, but around abortion and around like really complicated things of like, hey, who gets to set this stuff? So that's the part I would push back on is like, hey, that's just how we've always been. That's our DNA in this country, Cole, is like having those debates between what's federal versus what do states and localities get to decide.
Oh, I totally agree with you on that. It was super confusing a few years ago. I think we covered it on the pod. Like when Colorado, I think, was the first state to start requiring pay ranges be in job descriptions, and even for remote jobs. And that was like super confusing because you're like, your company's in New Jersey or something, be like, do I have to put my pay range because somebody might apply from Colorado? And all that did really is give, a bunch of employment lawyers jobs, which is, it's fine. It's whatever. But it's like, how do you deal with conflicting kind of ways of adjudicating laws when the laws don't necessarily reconcile with one another?
Well, they don't reconcile with each other. Plus, you got another layer of like organizations which are either national or multinational, and you have to like essentially go to the law that is the most stringent, and that becomes your base of operation right there.
Well, this is where it gets into, again, I don't know how much you guys want to go down this road, but like the Commerce Clause in our Constitution is very much around this point, right? Like when there is some kind of commerce across states that affects different locations, then the federal law can supersede or whatever, right? Like that's the point. It's literally trying to solve this confusion in a sense, right? Cole and Scott. And so one other area where this becomes an issue is international trade. Again, a topic that I studied, but like to your point, Scott, like that is an issue, right? Like different countries have different trade policies with different other like there's literally infinite permutations of like what that could be. And so if you're a business, you're just like, oh my God, how do I figure this out, right? And so again, that's something they've been trying to simplify and sort through. That same logic is going to apply when it comes to kind of laws around data governance, AI, like all of this is going to come out. Because you're right, Europe is going to, at the end of the day, Europe and the US just have very different philosophies and cultures around this kind of stuff, right? Like they're way more harsh around data privacy than we ever will be, in my opinion, right? And so we're going to have these differences.
Yeah, I mean, we've been dealing with GDPR for 15 years now, something like that. And it's fine if it's over in Europe, and we can kind of handle that from a US centric sort of standpoint. But when we have, different laws in individual states, it becomes much more complicated. But like from like a broader like AI perspective, be it privacy or, application, et cetera, where do you, if you had a crystal ball, like where do you see it headed? Where do you see it headed?
This is my view. Look, I think there's going to be a patchwork of regulations, right? I just think that's just again going back to the US, that's just how we work. Like California and Texas are not going to agree on how to regulate this stuff, right? They're just not. It's like we have different taxes in different jurisdictions. And so I think there's going to be different regulations. That being said, I do think there's going to be some federal guidelines. The White House has already put out a blueprint on responsible AI. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, who we're working with, they've already put a much more detailed set of controls and policies and principles around this stuff. And I think that wherever we end up with, I think that's going to be infused by what NIST comes up with. And then I think what we're going to end up with is some set of standards, right? So if you guys are familiar with SOC 2 compliance for InfoSec, right? You've probably heard of that. That at the end of the day, look, there's GDPR, there's CCPA, there's other things, but then the InfoSec is a common market standard, is a SOC 2 or ISO standard, right? And so I anticipate that's where this will go. You'll have some patchwork of regulations. You'll have guardrails and guidelines from federal government, and then you'll have a market standard that's infused by like someone like NIST. If you're a company, I think you'll really care about those standards because your customers will ask you about those standards and so on. There's a wise man, I won't quote, name him in this conversation.
Was it me?
But
Yes.
Thank you.
he had this really interesting insight, and I've been thinking about it since, where he said, companies don't care about regulations that apply to them. They care about regulations that apply to their customers.
Oh, I
Why
thought you
is
were
it-
going to say their competitors. I was like, oh, yeah, saucy.
But I thought this was interesting because his point was the regulations that apply to them, for the most part, not everything. Some of them are really harsh regulations, so it is what it is. But for the most part, they're the cost of doing business, right? They're just like, look, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, and I'll ask for forgiveness later, kind of thing. But if it affects my customer, and my customer is worried now, and I might lose my customer, that affects my top line. And I thought that was, and he's done some research on this to kind of, back this up. And I think that's what's going to end up happening, where again, these regulations will be there. Companies, I don't know if you've noticed this, very few companies are doing the audit in New York City. I don't know if you know this. And I think it's because they're just like, look, let's just wait and see. Let's just wait and see. Let's just wait and see. Let's see how it pans out. Let's see where it goes. But if their customers start asking questions, that's going to get them to move much faster.
Yeah, they're reading the tea leaves that like, hey, maybe this thing's gonna be superseded or something at some point. But I don't, Scott, do we have a confusion matrix for Guru today?
We do. We'll do 5 rapid fire questions for Guru. Are you prepared, Guru? You like mentally prepared for this?
I've been waiting the confusion matrix, man.
Okay, what's the first thing you do when you get home from work?
Well, I work at home now, so how do I answer that question?
I mean, it's a good conversation.
This is more of an existential question.
Yeah.
I need something. I don't know if you guys do. I need something to separate home and work, because my mind is always, and this is going to maybe connect to I don't know if we're going to go to the Charles de Gaulle story later on, but it's part of, I'm very absent-minded, and my head is always kind of thinking about stuff. And so I need to be present with my children and my family, my wife. Like I need some kind of separation. That's where actually the commute, not a long commute, but a short commute helped me. Like 15 minutes, kind of disassociate from what I was thinking about and get my head in the game for my family was actually kind of helpful. With the working from home, that's actually tough because my wife thinks I'm at home. I'm like literally standing in the kitchen, but my mind is a million miles away. So that's been a challenge.
I mean, like maybe the confusion matrix is just like one question, because I think this is like a great topic we haven't really discussed at length. I mean, it's so true. Like it's hard to disconnect when you're working from home. Like if I'm at the house, like I'm working in the bed, which is terrible for sleep hygiene, right? And there's no way, there's no stopping point. There's no starting point. You're just doing.
Right.
I had this weird experience, like right when and we mentioned this in probably some of our early episodes on the podcast, but right when the pandemic started to happen, and I used to hate my commute. I would, at the end of the day, I was working from home and I'd just go get in my car and drive to nowhere. I know that sounds crazy, but
just sublimating the urge.
And so like, I'm curious, just like, what do you do, Guru, to kind of get that closure at the end of the day? And I would love for you to tell the Charles de Gaulle story too, if you want to tie those two together.
It might be a good segue. So what I do actually now is we just moved. We built a home over the last 15 months. Just really fun journey. I know it's not often fun to build a home. It can go wrong, but we had a great experience and we built a beautiful home, and we're in a new neighborhood, and right behind our lot is like a forest. And so now what I'm doing, and it's got a pathway, it's got a walkway, and I just I do a loop, and I walk around for 20-25 minutes, and I come back, and by the time I'm back, my head's in a good space. So it's very similar to your going for a drive, Cole. So very, very similar there. The connection point here, the story that Cole was mentioning, is I'm in my own head all the time. My wife comments on this. It takes a bit to get me out of my head, and I'm very absent-minded. So just as a simple story to segue to Charles de Gaulle. So one time, went to meet some friends at a restaurant, came out of the restaurant, all 4 of my car doors were open. I just left them open. I just had no idea I left them open, right? It's just kind
4
of
doors though. 4 doors. That's pretty strong.
I've done 1 or 2 before. That time it was all 4.
I mean, like that's strong.
That's impressive. That's 3 doors that you didn't have to get out of. I can't even finish. Like, that's pretty silly.
So that's my thing. So in 2005, I was doing my PhD. Had a summer program in France. Was taking French. I landed in Charles de Gaulle Airport, and my French was still obviously pretty basic. And this is again 2005. We didn't have iPhones and stuff back then, and so
Yeah.
had my luggage after picked it up from baggage claim. Went to a payphone. That's what we used to use back then, and called my host mom and said, "Hey, I'm here." And I didn't realize she didn't speak a word of English, and she just went 100 miles an hour in French, and I was like, "Oh my God, what did she just say?" So again, red eye, complete confusion. I'm like, what is going on here? I don't know where I'm going. So of course, being absent-minded that I am, I left all my luggage right by that payphone and just hopped on the subway, care as can be, heading into downtown Paris. Realized at some point, hey, I'm kind of light-handed here. That doesn't make any sense. And realized I didn't have my luggage with me. So I was like, all right, I need to go back and get my luggage. So got back on the train, went back to the airport. And as I'm walking towards the airport from the metro, there's like hundreds of people standing outside the airport. I'm like, what could possibly be going on here? And I start making my way through, and there's people that are, cursing, they're pissed off, they're like, my flight's gonna leave. People are getting really upset. I guess it's been like half an hour. And then I got close enough where I could see through the window, like 8, dogs, cocaine, drug sniffing dogs, police officers with guns and everything around these 2 suitcases next to a payphone. And my heart just sank. I was like, holy shit, that's my luggage right there.
This is exactly what they warn you about, right? Like if you see unintended baggage, notify someone immediately.
If you see something, say something, right? Kind of thing. So,
It's like,
and remember, this is 2005, guys. So 9/11 wasn't that long ago, and there were some attacks in Europe. That's either that summer or the year before. In Madrid, there was a bombing. And in some other place in Europe, there was a bombing. And so this was just every place was just heightened around this stuff, right? And so I finally tried to get to the front, and this guy's like, no, there's a bomb in there. There's a bomb in there. You can't go inside. I'm like, guys.
You're never getting those bags back. They're going to blow those things up before they give them back to you.
Like tiptoeing between the SWAT team and the K9 unit. I'm just going to grab my bag.
So suffice to say, I had a lot of nasty stares, a lot of people pissed off at me. And the funniest part was when I finally got to my host mom late that night, the first thing she let off was, "Can you believe someone shut down the airport?" And I just didn't, I just didn't have the heart to tell her what are the details on that story. So.
Oh yeah, how do you explain that? Oh my God.
I love that. Well, Guru, do you want to join us for the nerdery?
I love it. I can nerd out anytime.
I went on an Alex Pentland roll. He's one of my favorite authors, and I just went through Google Scholar and started checking it out. This one caught my eye.
Who is that, Scott?
He is a professor at MIT. I don't know if you'd call him a network analysis guy. I think he calls himself more like social physics, but he uses all sorts of metadata to analyze the social network. He's got a great book called Social Physics. Highly recommended. It changed how I think about data interactions and how people operate. It's just absolutely fantastic. But he uses all these sort of data sources to understand how people operate and how they behave.
So I would love that. Social physics. All right, I'm looking.
Social physics. It's easy read. It's a pack full of information. It's absolutely wonderful. What's the name of this article? Unique in the shopping mall on the re-identifiability of credit card metadata. So large-scale data are transforming how we work and live. So we know about map directions and Netflix movie recommendations, rather. But these data may not be as private as we think, especially when they're de-identified and or sold to third parties. And credit card data, especially, as you know, this Guru working for Capital One, this data is regularly sold to third parties for credit scores or fraud verification, this sort of stuff. So they took 3 months of credit card data, and they essentially found that even when it's obfuscated, 4 transactions is enough to re-identify 90% of individuals. Even when the data is made more coarse, so aggregating it to various levels, 10 transactions is enough to re-identify almost everybody. Wow. Women tend to be more identifiable from this information based on where they shop and when they shop. I think that's an odds ratio of 1.21. But just because there's no name and phone number on this data doesn't mean it's necessarily private. And this isn't a new article, but I think hits home for a lot of things that we do and how our data is going to be used in the future for sure.
I didn't realize that this is what we were talking about, because I remember coming across this a few years ago. And the question I always had about this is not whether de-identified data can eventually be identified because of the number of transactions it takes, is could you decode whole databases at scale using this methodology, or could you only do it for like one person? Like, would it take you 5 hours to do this for one person, or could you run an algorithm and would it de-identify whole hundreds, if not millions, of people all at once using this methodology?
Think about it. Okay, so that they're essentially saying, like, we know that someone made a purchase here and they made a purchase there, and we can essentially match them up. But think about, like, in an organization, say like you got a data set and it's just a list of variables, and it was like health data, so like heart screenings and like all this sort of stuff, and you need to know their date of birth, you know their gender, and like whether they've had a flu vaccination or whatever. And say you had a list of people's names plus their gender plus their date of birth. With just those two things, I imagine you could re-identify 95, 98% of individuals in the company, right? So even though you have no PII information, it's an idiosyncrasy of data science, really. Like, you can re-identify people fairly easily with just a couple key bits of information.
Because this has always been my question or criticism, is like, I'll talk to vendors or other companies and they'll be like, oh yeah, we did identify everything, so you don't have to worry about privacy concerns. And like, I'm pretty sure there's methodologies for getting around that fairly simply. But the big question I've always had is, could you figure it out for every single human being in the data set all at once? And I'm not sure I know the answer to that. It sounds like you could do it fairly easy if you have certain pieces of PII.
Yeah.
But maybe, like, if it's just credit card transactions and credit card transactions alone, I'm curious how difficult it would be to able to do that at scale.
I don't know. I don't know what other bits of information. This is a rather short article. But where I thought he was really going to go is like something he talks about in other cases, which is like essentially tracking. Once you know someone's, say, obfuscated credit card number, then you know every transaction they made. Then you can track them to every location. Then you can track, their spending habits, and that person made that purchase, which most time I wouldn't care, but some things I don't necessarily want you to know.
I think there's a couple interesting things about this. First, I'll start off with a joke, which is like, maybe we should all just go randomly shop in random places that we never do, just to throw all of this off, right? Like, I'm going to go eat at a place I never normally eat at, or I'm going to go, you know what I mean? Just to like make it a little bit harder. But maybe there's a little
stochastic terrorism that we brought up on the podcast before.
Exactly. Introduce some stochastic nature to the data. That's right. That's right. But I think, Scott, you started going in the direction that my head really always goes on this stuff, which is around, when it comes to data privacy, what do I actually care about?
Yeah.
Right. Like, and one of the things I think as Americans we've realized through kind of the whole debate around Facebook data and all this stuff is like, I just don't know how much Americans care about their data privacy, right? Like these companies like Apple, man, Google, they know
everything,
way more information about us than we could even fathom, right? Because it's their job. Like, they literally spend hours every day thinking about how to track, what information can they get, what data can they get, how can they target people? Like, that's with personalized stuff, like that's their business. That's what they think about all day, and we don't. So they have thought about stuff way more than we have, and they're doing it. And so we have not really pushed back as a society, in my view. And so there's a part of me that's like, look, the average person doesn't care that much. And then the point comes to like, what do you care about? What does Cole care about? What does Scott care about? What do I care about? Like, do I care if someone knows where I shopped yesterday? Not really. So what do I care about? And it's worth kind of getting into that level of the conversation of like, what kind of things are we worried about here?
My viewpoint on this is, it goes back to the point from earlier about simplicity versus nuance. It's like, the argument you just made for why this is creepy is way too nuanced. We need something simple to get people behind it. It's like, people are going to see all the naughty stuff you've bought unless we do this. And the people are like, get rid of it.
Is there a generational difference here too? Like, are older, people in society more cautious about this sort of thing, or like newer, younger people? Like I know everything is out there. I know that everyone can see everything. Plus, I get these added benefits from Google or Waze or
That's right.
Apple because I get better recommendations, this sort of thing.
That's
And
right.
should we care? I don't really know.
Exactly. I think that's a good point. The generational difference is important. And then also, what's the value prop, right? If
Yeah,
someone is giving you a
yeah.
value prop, if Google Maps, I love Google Maps. I'm not getting rid of it. So I'm probably going to do what I need to do to just keep using it. And yeah, they'll know where I've been, right? And I'm okay with that, right? So what are you getting in return is always going to be part of that equation.
I mean, it goes back to the whole, like, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product type of argument. And so you are getting some kind of value from it, and that's why you're using it. And it doesn't have a cost, but it has a cost. And I'm pretty firmly in the camp that, people should have the ability, if they want to be private. But I would think privacy by default should be the settings in most products, even though it's not.
Opt-in model. Yeah.
Yeah, opt-in versus opt-out.
Yeah.
Or like something like, hey, you get additional features if you're willing to share your data, stuff like that, right? Like that's something you actually do in the B2B space a bit, right? Where you're like, hey, if you're willing to if you're willing to share your data with us and allow us to ingest your data into our overall model, then we can give you benchmarking, or we can give you this, or we can give you that, right?
I mean, that's why we early on in the podcast, we had a guest on, Renee Davis. We were talking a lot about like Web3, because that was the thing I was so curious about Web3, is that you were going to be able to monetize your data, right? Rather than them just, hoovering up all of your data and then them selling it and making money off of it. You actually own your data, and then you could monetize it. Now, I know all the like Web3 stuff seems to have blown up recently, but I think the premise is still there. Somebody's going to figure this out. I don't know if it's going to be the Web3 people or somebody that comes after it, but fundamentally, it seems like, who you are and your likeness is something that you should own into perpetuity, unless somebody's willing to pay you for it.
This is a great point. I want to connect it to a couple threads we've already talked about, which is one is around AI, and the other is around kind of monetization and, of these things. So here's the next level, right? I don't know if you guys have seen this, but there have been lawsuits around some of these large language models, right? Where the large language models depend, and they train on all of this corpus of digital data, right? And that digital data they access pretty freely, right? A lot of it is open source, a lot of it's out there for free. And where it wasn't for free, they probably paid a little bit to access the data or whatever, but like they accessed your data, Scott, your data, Cole, my data, and like, everyone else's data, without which there is no LLM, right? And so what is your ownership stake in OpenAI? What should it be? Should you get some kind of annuity, right? Like from some kind of dividend from their profits?
Then they pull up the ladder on the back end as well and don't let you use their data.
I mean, I think we talked about this a few weeks ago, Scott, but I've completely quit using OpenAI to edit anything that I do for that exact reason. Because essentially, I'm just giving them everything I write and putting that into their training model.
You just continue to give them more data. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And so I just quit doing it just based on principle for that reason.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So to me, it's almost less about privacy. I think privacy is important, but like I said, I don't know if Americans have really cared about it. To me, it's more around ownership, right? And that's the flip side of the privacy coin. Who owns it in terms of monetization?
Data bill of rights.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
To bring it full circle, Alex Bentley does have like a great section on this sort of like data privacy, what we should do with it, opt-in modeling, all this sort of stuff. Highly recommend it for anyone that's interested.
Well, I think it's a great transition, Scott, into the next topic about the Detroit Lions. Do you want to talk about that? Because I mean, this is all within the same kind of sphere of influence.
Absolutely, like it's great. We have, and this is a TikTok video, by the way.
I saw it. It was short enough. I clicked on it when you put in your email, and that was fascinating. But go ahead.
I want to know more about TikTok's like algorithm. Like, how the hell do they keep everyone so engaged? Like, they got the teenagers by the hair for sure. But the Detroit Lions are using AI at Ford Field there in Detroit. So they noticed they have like massive people lining up at the gates, and everyone crowded into one gate. But using a series of dynamic signage and emailing, they get people to distribute to other gates. Obviously, get better flow of people into the stadium, this sort of stuff. But they're also using a tool called Crowd IQ to analyze fan behavior. So they can detect fights in the stands by the density of opposing fans and beers sold in a section. So obviously deploy more cops to these places. They can also place ads on video boards when fans are more likely to look at the screen, and they can also target it based on age, race, gender, etc. in specific spaces, so they can charge more for these ad boards because they are targeted. And, just increase the overall fan experience by sending, say, the mascot to a section that has a bunch of children in it. So, make everyone happy through use of AI. Really fascinating.
I had one thing, because you left out a really critical point, because a lot of the stuff in that video seemed brilliant. I was like, these are really smart people. But you left out the critical point, which is they were using facial recognitions, like video software, to analyze the crowd and whether or not they were watching the video board or seeing an ad. And I was like, okay, this tilted from being like good business to really creepy and dystopian. And they just kind of like plug that in there a little bit, like in that video. I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. And then the other joke I wanted to make is like targeting fights in Detroit. I was like, are they just going to target the whole stadium? I mean, it's Detroit. Come on.
Who's fighting over a Lions game anyway? Like,
yeah, exactly.
Or you could argue there's nothing interesting going on in the field, so you got to start a fight. So you take it either way on that one. So no, in their defense, the Lions were decent last year.
They were. I kid. The facial recognition is really interesting, though. Like I've seen, like, obviously San Francisco is having a tough time with theft and this sort of stuff. I think it was a 7-Eleven has facial recognition software at the door. It won't let you in unless you show your face and like you're ostensibly approved to go inside. Which
because they would have tracked you if you had done something
exactly
or something wrong before, and then you could be excluded from that list.
Exactly. And like, heaven forbid that information gets shared across Walgreens to CVS to Walmart to whoever else. You're not allowed to any business, like a social credit score, essentially.
It's a really interesting debate, right? Like, there are cameras everywhere now. It actually boggles my mind. Like, whenever I'm into true crime a little bit, I don't know if you guys are into true crime, but like, it's kind of entertaining. And like, one of the things I've realized, like following this stuff, is there are cameras everywhere. Like, they will, like, if a crime happens, they will like go through and like they'll like look at that location and all the cameras that are like in and around that location, and they'll collect all sorts of evidence. And I don't even know. I don't even know where all the cameras are. And so already we live in a situation now. There's the one side of it that's kind of creepy, and there's the other side of it is like, hey, if that reduces crime, how do I feel about it?
The only solution to committing a crime, Guru, is to be completely ambiguously looking so that you blend in. There's no way, like, you're like a chameleon.
Aggressively generic.
Yes, well, aggressively, the most average person in history.
I don't know if you guys.
I think we threw him off, Scott.
My mind like exploded with that comment, but like, but I don't know if you guys are following some of this data. One of the things I mentioned I love is geeking out on social sciences. And so anyway, so the crime data. So there was a big thing where in 2020, 2021, crime went way up, right? And it was just like something everyone was talking about, crime went up. 2023 is looking like it's going to be back like similar to 2019, right? And I think there's a bunch of interesting reasons for this. One, just I think COVID just made us all, brought out the worst in all of us in so many different ways, right? Like being isolated and all those kinds of things. But to your point, we were all wearing masks for a while. And when you wear a mask, you are less able to be identified. And so you're like, that increases the incentive to go commit a crime, because you're like, yeah, I'm wearing a mask. I can go commit a crime.
Yeah, there was a point in time that the only people that wore masks were bank robbers, you know?
You inverse the social relationship. Absolutely. We're not allowed into a store without a mask on.
Yeah, exactly. So now you're like, oh, no one knows if I do anything wrong here, right? So I actually think there's some really interesting, I think COVID was almost one of these fascinating sociological experiments that makes it interesting to see, hey, how do we behave in abnormal times? And like, what are the kind of the results of those behavioral changes?
The social norms really broke down because, like, people just weren't on the streets anymore, and people were also cooped up. And I think you go stir crazy.
You start driving to nowhere. Like, I didn't have to work.
Driving to nowhere, the bridge to nowhere, driving to nowhere. But like, the other thing that was crazy is kind of also how we started group identifying ourselves based on like, okay, you can wear a mask in a crowded theater, but walking down the street, that's kind of weird. So we started judging people on like where they wore masks, how often they wore masks. It got really interesting.
Alone in a car.
Exactly.
Big auditorium, stadium.
The good old days that I don't necessarily want to go back to. But well, maybe
Exactly.
we'll get to the last nerdery topic. I came across this LinkedIn post from the CEO of Portable, and we'll link to it in the show notes. But he was talking about what you should do if you were starting a data function at a company. He says for 1,000-person company, but the advice in here was amazing. And I had a lot of these similar thoughts, and I would be curious to kind of run this off you, Guru, because I know you've started some functions before in the past. He goes through 5 weeks of what you should do. But week 1 for me was like it in a nutshell. I was like, if you're just doing week 1, you're on the right track. And I see so many people who aren't doing it this way. He said, schedule a meeting with everyone in the C-suite, identify the top 3 data-related questions that each executive needs to answer, and figure out a way to get them to answer with manual or automated data if they don't already have answers to those questions. And I was like, oh, this is like simple blocking and tackling, and so many people can't figure this out. He goes through week 2, week 3. There's really great advice in here. I ask you to check out the link yourself, but from your experience, Guru, what did you think about this advice?
Loved it. Absolutely love it. In fact, I use a different terminology. All the folks that were on my team will recognize this if they're listening in. But I tell everyone, be useful. The first thing, be useful, right? Because you're a data scientist, you have access. Like, one of the cool things about being a people analyst is it's actually a really cool job. You have access to such cool and interesting data that can give you insights that are just fascinating insights. And so it's really easy to just run off in different directions and be like, oh, I want to study this, or I want to analyze this, or I want to study that. And you got to really squash that impulse. And so unfortunately, it took me a lot longer than a week. It took me probably like 2 months. And part of the reason is because I'm not sure even the executives know what they want sometimes. Because sometimes I'd go to them and be like, because that's how I would lead off the conversation. I'm like, what do you want answered? And then they'd be like, oh, I want this, then go. And then half an hour later, I'm like, I don't think they answered my question, right? And
so here, this is an important caveat, Guru, because I see a lot of people making that type of kind of foot fault, which is they go in and they say, what people analytics data are you needing to answer your questions? And they're like, I don't know.
Yeah.
What you need to ask them is like, what are the top 3 things you're focusing on right now? Right? And they know what they're focusing on. That's not a tough question to answer. And then it's your job as a people analytics professional to say, here's data you might have considered related to these 3 focus areas. And this is where your expertise gets valued. But I find so many people that are like, well, what are the analytics that you want to see? And it's like, what are you talking about? You're supposed to tell me.
Answer my questions.
Yeah.
I love that addition. That's absolutely right. But I think the broader point of like, having them tell you what they are caring about, what they're prioritizing, what matters to them, and then being as useful as possible on those questions. Now, here's the part 2 of it, and I haven't read the link, and I don't know if he goes in this direction. Once you then do that 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, now you have a relationship, you have credibility, you have trust, and then you can come back to them and be like, hey, Cole, I know this is what you're focused on, but I think that's the wrong thing to focus on. Why don't you focus over here? But that can't be the place where you start. So I love that point.
Just building some social currency and putting yourself in the black instead of the red.
100%.
That's
100%.
the key.
I think that social currency is a really interesting point because there's 2 ways to read this. Like, one is a single person coming in trying to stand up a function from nothing, and this is a perfect plan. Go figure out from the CEO and like the senior executives what they want to prioritize. 2, like, say there's already a group, a bunch of data scientists, they just don't have a leader. You come in. What I'm not seeing here is like figure out your team's capabilities. There's no like understanding what your team is actually able to do in this, which like it sounds like in that second scenario, someone that just wants to go visit with the senior executives and not care about their actual team. In that case, I wouldn't want to work with them.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I think he's talking about starting a function at like a small company.
Yeah.
But yeah, I get the point that you're making.
Like, I think he's saying from close to scratch. So maybe there wasn't an existing team there, Scott. Or
Exactly.
That's how
Exactly. So like I said, there's 2 ways to read it, but I love the aspect of just focusing on what will make the biggest business hit.
And just to add one more point on this, because I think it's just so important. Brian Chesky, a founder and CEO of Airbnb, has this quote where he says, in the beginning, do things that don't scale, because everyone's always talking about scale, right? Like how do you automate it? How do you scale things, and et cetera? And absolutely, eventually that's important. But your first 3 projects, your first 3 customers, your first 3 things that you're doing, I don't know the exact words that you use there, Cole, reading off that post, but like, it doesn't matter if you're using technology, if you're doing it by hand, whatever, manually, not manually, just go do it and make that person want to work with you again.
Yeah, first be valuable for sure. Guru, this has been a really fun conversation. That I think we've covered a lot of territory and gotten very technical in some ways that we haven't done recently. So I'm super excited about this going live. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before I give you the final words, Scott, any final words for Guru?
Guru, super pleasure to talk to you again. Fascinating conversation. Where can folks reach you if they want to reach out?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn, and we'll have something on Twitter soon, but I'll let you know when that happens. And otherwise, my email is guru@fairnow.ai. So feel free to reach out, and would love to say I enjoyed this. This is not, I knew this coming in. I've listened to you guys before, not like a typical kind of podcast. We talk about so many different things, fun stuff, serious stuff, all of that. And, you know, hope to do this again in person sometime soon, guys.
Absolutely. I love it. You went Twitter. You're not even going Threads. You're not doing the Twitter versus Threads.
Oh man,
thing.
that's a whole other conversation we can have about Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and the cage mask.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Guru. You've been listening to Directionally Correct, a People Analytics podcast with Cole and Scott and Guru Sethupathy. Thank you, Guru.
Thanks, guys.
As always, all opinions are our own and do not reflect those of any other organization.
You've been listening to Directionally Correct, a People Analytics podcast with Cole and Scott.